In a small corner of the world, where the wind whispered through empty fields and the sun spilled gold over quiet paths, there lived a boy who seemed to belong to no one. He was poor in the way that the world measures, with nothing to show and very little to hold. Yet there was a weight in him, a weight that did not press on his shoulders, but settled deep inside, where it could not be seen. They did not notice it at first. They laughed at his quiet, thinking it strange, or worse, weak. They did not understand that silence can carry more strength than words ever could. Have you ever seen someone so still that it almost hurts to watch them? That was the boy. His stillness was not emptiness. It was a holding, a keeping of himself, a careful saving of something precious that the world could not touch. He walked slowly, almost as if the earth itself reminded him to move gently. And when they spoke to him, their voices sharp and full of expectation, he did not answer immediately. Sometimes he did not answer at all. Did they see the courage it took to remain quiet when every part of the world seemed to demand a reply? Or did they only see the silence as a lack? The boy watched more than he spoke. He noticed how the light fell differently on the old walls, how the wind carried scents from far away, how the laughter of others often contained more sorrow than joy. These were small things, ordinary things, and yet he cherished them. In those quiet moments, he understood himself in ways that no one else could. He felt the stirrings of his own heart, the sharp edges of his own fears, and the soft places where hope might grow, and still they mistook his watching for weakness. They never paused to see the fire that burned gently within him, hidden behind a calm face. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the afternoon, he would sit under a tree, leaning against the rough bark, and let the world go on around him. They would pass by, laughing, shouting, perhaps trying to catch his attention, and he would simply breathe. The air filled his lungs and reminded him that he was alive, that the world could not own him, not fully. Did he feel lonely? Yes. Did the quiet ever feel like a cage? Sometimes. But in that quiet, he discovered something else, a freedom that noise could never give. The freedom to feel, to think, to be himself, even when they did not understand. He noticed the way they moved, the way they measured everything by what they could see or touch, and he realized that their judgments were never about him, really, but about the emptiness they carried inside themselves. They had no patience for subtlety. They had no room for gentle strength. And so he remained still. He let the world pass around him, neither fighting nor fleeing. His silence was not surrender. It was a small, quiet defiance. He was learning that the weight he carried was his own, not theirs, and that it could not be diminished by their misunderstanding. In the evenings, when the sky grew soft and pale, and the first stars began to pierce the quiet darkness, he would walk slowly back to the small place he called home. The silence followed him, wrapping around him like a familiar cloak. He did not need applause or recognition. He did not need to prove that he was strong. The strength lived inside him already, tucked in the spaces between his thoughts, in the gentle rhythms of his breath, in the way he chose to hold himself when the world insisted he must bow. And in that quiet, he began to understand that being unnoticed was not the same as being powerless. They laughed. They judged. They pushed and pulled and tried to shape him into what they expected, and he let them. Not because he agreed, not because he feared, but because he knew that reaction would scatter the weight inside him, the careful keeping of his own life. The boy learned slowly that silence could be a shield, a teacher, and even a companion. In silence, he could hear the truth of himself. He could feel the small but steady pulse of strength that the world could not erase, and as the sun sank and the shadows grew long, he carried that quiet fire within him, unshaken, unbent, unseen, and in that unseen fire, he held everything he would one day need. It was not a grand strength. It did not roar. It did not demand attention, but it was real. And in that stillness, in that careful, patient keeping of himself, the boy knew something that they could not understand, that the quietest hearts often carry the deepest power, and that sometimes the world must pass by before it learns to notice at all. Would you not pause, if you could, to sit a moment with him under that tree, to breathe the air he breathes, to feel the quiet that he carries, to understand how much can exist in silence before a word is ever spoken? And in that pause, perhaps, you would feel what he feels. That there is more in watching, in waiting, in holding yourself gently than in rushing to meet the world's loud demands. That in quiet, the soul can learn its own strength, and the boy's small hidden fire continues to burn, softly, patiently, timelessly. There were days when the world felt heavier than usual, when the laughter of others echoed like a sharp wind across an empty field. The boy felt it then, that restless pull to answer back, to speak and be heard, to defend himself in ways that seemed simple to everyone else. Did they notice the way their words cut, or the way their voices pressed against the thin walls of his patience? Perhaps not. They only knew what they wanted him to be. And the quiet boy was never enough. It was in those moments that silence became a test, a mirror, a weight that he carried alone. Have you ever felt the urge to speak, to let the world know the pain it does not see? The boy felt it constantly. A sharp edge of frustration pressed against his chest, and his heart would thrum in protest, as if it could not understand why he should bear their words so calmly. It was not that he did not feel anger or hurt or the sting of being misunderstood. He felt it deeply. Sometimes the ache made his hands clench, his jaw tighten, and his eyes burn with quiet heat. Yet he did not let it spill outward. He held it within, like a fragile bird in his hands, careful not to break it with rash action or sudden words. They could not see it, of course. They could not know that his stillness was not emptiness, but an ocean of thought, a quiet deliberation that no one could glimpse. He watched them as they spoke and laughed, measuring, comparing, always reaching, always expecting, and he felt the tug between instinct and restraint. Why does it matter what they think, he wondered? Why does their judgment press so heavily when it cannot touch the truth of him? And still, the world demanded an answer, a reply, a spark of reaction to prove that he existed on their terms. Sometimes, when the sunlight fell low and the shadows stretched long, he would retreat to the small patch of earth he claimed for himself. There, he could feel the pulse of his own breath, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the quiet rhythm of his heart. Did the world see the courage it took to remain so composed? Perhaps not, but he knew, in the slow, careful beat of each moment, that restraint was not surrender. It was choice. It was the deliberate act of keeping himself whole when the currents of anger and hurt tried to pull him apart. It was not always easy. The boy would sometimes feel the sharp pangs of longing to shout, to call their attention, to demand that they see him as he truly was. And in those moments, his thoughts would race, like wild horses trapped in a narrow field. But he would breathe. He would remember that the words, the anger, the insistence of others did not define him. They were like stones tossed into the air. They made a noise, they fell, but they could not become him unless he allowed them to. And he did not. There were times when their misjudgment stung more than the cruelest words. They whispered behind his back, laughed at what they assumed was weakness, and assumed he would break. Did he feel small in those moments? Perhaps. But even in the weight of their gaze, he discovered a strange clarity. He could feel the currents of his own mind, the delicate edges of his patience, the quiet strength that lived in watching rather than reacting. And slowly, he began to understand that not every moment demanded a voice, not every hurt demanded a reply, and not every expectation demanded compliance. In the quiet of the afternoon, when the wind carried only soft murmurs and the sunlight fell in gentle slants across the land, he would let the tension in his chest dissolve. He did not need to respond to them immediately, or ever. The silence around him was a balm, a gentle teacher. He learned that some battles are not won by clamor or argument, but by the quiet persistence of self-possession. In holding himself steady, he discovered that anger loses its power when it cannot find a mirror, that frustration becomes small when it is observed rather than expressed, and that inner peace begins in the space between impulse and action. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the day, he would close his eyes and let the sounds of the world wash over him without interference. The shouts, the whispers, the judgments, the law, all flowed past, like water around a stone. And in that quiet, he felt the pulse of his own life, steady, calm, unshaken. He understood, in a way that only silence can teach, that true strength is not in the reaction, but in the choosing not to react. That sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is simply to keep the heart whole, the mind calm, and the soul unbroken even when they tried to rattle it. And so he learned slowly, gently, with the quiet rhythm of patience, that the world might never understand him. They might never see the effort it takes to remain so still, the courage in letting their words pass like shadows. But that understanding was not necessary. What mattered was the quiet discipline he carried within, the careful keeping of himself, the inner space where no one could trespass. In that space, he began to feel a small but growing power, the kind that does not shout, that does not demand, that does not need their recognition. And in that power, he found a deep, enduring peace. They tried to measure him in ways that made no sense, as if the world could weigh the quiet and find it wanting. They looked at the smallness of his possessions, the modesty of his clothes, the careful pace of his steps, and they thought that they knew him. But what could they know of the quiet currents that flowed beneath his calm face? What could they know of the hours he spent listening to the wind, tracing the shadows of clouds, feeling the rise and fall of his own breath in the stillness of the afternoon? They saw only what they wanted to see, and in that seeing, they missed everything that truly mattered. Have you ever been looked at in such a way that your very presence seemed to confuse the world? That was the boy, always under their gaze, yet never captured by it. They could not reach him, could not understand that strength does not always roar. That could. Rage does not always clench fists or raise a voice. It moves quietly, like a river beneath the ice, deep and unseen, shaping the world without making noise. And slowly, he began to notice something curious. The harder they tried to define him, the clearer he became to himself. He watched them as they moved, as they judged, as they tried to bend the world to their expectations. And in watching, he began to understand a subtle truth. They were not against him, not really. They were against the discomfort that his quiet revealed, against the mirror his restraint held up to their own impatience. Did it make him angry? Perhaps, in a faint, flickering way. But anger was fleeting, and he could feel it slipping away when he let it pass, like smoke through his fingers. He discovered, with a gentle astonishment, that the space between their words and his response was a place of immense power. In that space, he learned to breathe more deeply, to listen more closely, to feel the stirrings of his own heart without rushing to reply. He discovered that when they spoke sharply or mocked gently, he could remain whole. When they tried to measure his worth by their own shallow rules, he could remain undisturbed. He was learning in the quietest of ways that the judgments of others could never diminish the value of what lived quietly within him. And slowly, ever so slowly, he began to recognize a new kind of strength, one that did not shout, that did not fight, that did not bend or bow, but simply was. Have you ever noticed how water wears away stone? Not by force, but by persistence, by patient touch. So too was his quiet power. Every insult, every expectation, every attempt to provoke him was like a droplet striking the surface of a steady rock, and he did not crack. He did not bend. He did not bend. He did not let the shape of himself be defined by what was not true. Instead, he held to the contours of his own being, learning that they could not shape him unless he allowed it. And he did not. Sometimes he would feel their words settle in the air around him, heavy like clouds before a storm. And in that weight, he would close his eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of his own pulse, the quiet steadiness of his breath. Could they know what it was to hold oneself so carefully? Could they know what it meant to choose calm when the world demanded noise? To choose restraint when the world demanded reaction? Perhaps not. And yet, that was the very thing that made him free. He began to notice how their frustration grew, how their confusion increased, how their eyes searched for a spark that never came. Did he feel triumph in this? Only a quiet awareness. Not triumph, not revenge, not the satisfaction of proving them wrong, just understanding. Understanding that in the silence, in the restraint, he was discovering the contours of his own spirit, the gentle depth of his own heart, the subtle power that does not announce itself, but simply is. The days passed, and slowly the world began to shift, though not because it noticed him, and not because he changed outwardly. It shifted because he had changed outwardly. He had discovered a stillness that was unshakable, a calm that could not be disturbed, a self-possession that no mockery, no judgment, no expectation could touch. In that quiet, he found a strength that was invisible to the eye, but unbreakable in its own measure. And so he walked among them, present but not moved, aware but not disturbed, carrying a power that did not need to be announced. It was the power of holding oneself, the power of choosing restraint, the power of being undisturbed by the confusion or judgment of others. And in that power, he felt something gentle but immense, the certainty that he was enough, not because they acknowledged it, but because he had never wavered from himself. He realized, slowly, as the sun sank and shadows grew long, that strength does not always show itself in the way others expect. Sometimes it is measured not by noise, but by calm. Not by reaction, but by choice. Not by what the world sees, but by what the soul quietly knows. And in that knowing, the boy felt a deep, unshakable clarity that he had discovered a power they could never reach, a freedom they could never touch, and a quiet strength that would remain with him, always, even when no one noticed at all. In time, the world grew quieter around him, not because it had changed, but because he had. They still moved, as they always did, still spoke as they always spoke, still tried to measure and name what they did not understand. But he no longer felt the need to meet them on their terms. He had discovered, quietly and slowly, that the heart can hold itself steady when the noise presses, that the soul can remain untouched when the world reaches for it. And so he walked among them, present but undisturbed, carrying a calm that no one could take, a strength that did not need their notice to exist. Have you ever felt the relief of simply being, without the weight of proving yourself to anyone? That was how he began to feel. Slowly, like a river settling into its own course, like the wind finding its way around the stones without rushing or forcing. He did not boast. He did not explain. He did not demand attention. He simply moved with the quiet rhythm of his own being, each step measured by the pulse of his heart, each breath a reminder that he belonged first to himself before belonging to anything else. There were times when he looked back and thought of the days when they had tried to shake him, when their voices had pressed like heavy rain, when their laughter had felt sharp enough to pierce his calm. And he realized nothing that no one could ever take from him, that his restraint, his silence, his quiet refusal to react had not been weakness, nor had it been submission. It had been the slow building of something stronger than noise, stronger than judgment, stronger than their expectations. It had been the quiet shaping of himself into a presence that needed no permission, no approval, no applause. He understood now that walking away unshaken does not mean walking without feeling. It does not mean denying the hurt, ignoring the frustration, or pretending the world is always kind. It simply means keeping the center of yourself steady when the outer world shakes. It means holding the fragile frame of your own heart without letting it be blown out by their wind. And he felt that flame burn quietly within him, soft but unyielding, a light no one could dim, a warmth no one could steal. Sometimes he would sit alone in the quiet under the gentle stretch of the sky and think of all the moments when he had held himself back, when he had chosen silence over reaction, when he had let their judgments pass like clouds without storming after them. Did he feel regret? Perhaps for the fleeting times he had wavered, for the moments he had let frustration rise too close to the surface. But mostly, he felt a deep, slow satisfaction, not in pride, but in the quiet certainty that he had discovered something rare, the ability to remain whole, unshaken, and true to himself, even when the world insisted otherwise. Have you ever noticed how the wind moves through a field of grass? It bends the blades. It whispers across the earth. It may even leave some broken in its passage, but the field remains, steady in its own being, gentle and present, unafraid of the storms that sweep past. So too was he, a presence in the world that no words could capture, no expectation could alter, no judgment could dim. Inish. His calm was not a show, nor a retreat. It was a presence, quiet, steady, complete. And in that presence, he found a kind of freedom that had nothing to do with changing them, nothing to do with proving them wrong, nothing to do with their understanding. Freedom, he realized, is not found in the noise of being noticed, but in the quiet of being oneself. It is in the slow breathing, the patient watching, the deliberate choosing to carry the self with dignity and care. It is in knowing that even if no one sees the strength inside you, it exists, steadfast and enduring, quietly shaping the path you walk. So he moved through the world gently, not hurried, not anxious, not seeking. He had learned that the truest power lies in holding oneself with care, in refusing to be shaken by what they say or do, in letting the quiet strength grow unseen and undisturbed. And in that quiet, he felt a peace that no loud voice could offer, a calm that no argument could disturb, a certainty that no one could take. He did not need them to understand, nor did he need them to acknowledge him. He had learned that walking away unshaken is not a final act, but a daily practice, a gentle discipline, a steady keeping of oneself. And in the soft, slow rhythm of his own life, he discovered that what matters most is not how the world measures you, but how you carry yourself. Not how loudly you are heard, but how deeply you are at peace within. And so he continued, quietly, gently, fully himself, carrying a strength that could never be touched, a calm that could never be broken, and a heart that belonged first and last to him alone.